Bob Batty is a friend of many of us. He is from Cedarburg. He's done many things for the Cedarburg Legion, and he served as state commander. And he's got a unique story to tell us. But Bob, before we introduce you, will you tell us, come on up here, tell us who's at your table here. You have some of your friends and family.
Sure. I'd like to introduce to you tonight my wife Janice, my daughter Laura, and my son Paul. And also sitting at a table are my good friends who I think are here to cheer me on, hopefully, Jerry Smith and Ray Ronchetti.
Bob, it's you got a good hour and 15 minutes to talk. You want to move the podium out further?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're going to want to be still or walk around. Every speaker.
Maybe a little bit.
I've got a pointer here, so if you want to prop this up, talk into that, see if it's live.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's welcome Bob Batty. Back to over 50 years ago.
Literally. Well, I want to say it's an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight to speak to you, and I appreciate the turnout here tonight. I know that you're probably looking down at your placemats wondering, no, this can't be the guy. The version on the placemats is the 20-year-old model, and tonight you're stuck with the 74-year-old model. So in any case, last time I was here also, and I was announced, some people came up to me and they said, well, you know, are you going to have some dogs here? You know, I understand everybody likes to have the dogs here. And I was thinking, well, not these dogs, because if I brought the dogs that I had in Vietnam, I could probably clear this room in about a minute and a half. And that's, you know, looking at people who aren't moving that fast. But what I'd like to do tonight is start off with just a brief history and an introduction of myself. The brief history of military working dogs. Obviously, dogs have been companions of humans for probably millennia. They established a relationship way back when, and dogs have been used throughout the centuries in military capacities. But I'm not going to get too deep. I'm just going to go back to World War I, which is in the more modern history. And when it came to World War I, the British, the French, and the Germans, they all had military working dog programs. It turns out that the United States did not. They had none whatsoever. However, there were a couple dogs, one in particular that distinguished itself during World War I, and this dog was named Stubby. And Stubby was a bull terrier, and he was actually the pet of one of the soldiers who was deploying overseas on a troop ship, and this soldier snuck Stubby in with him. So Stubby came over, and he became a pet and a mascot of the unit, and the unit was the 102nd Infantry Division. And Stubby proved to be very useful. He was used as a messenger dog. They would tie messages to him and they would send him over to headquarters, and then they would send the dog back with another message. And Stubby was fast and he was low to the ground, and he wasn't getting shot at like the carrier pigeons that they also used. But Stubby really honored himself when one night the division was attacked by a German gas attack, and Stubby picked it up long before the gas reached the soldiers in the trenches, and they were able to get prepared, get their gas masks on, and get to safety. And for that, Stubby was awarded a Victory Medal of Honor. And fortunately, Stubby made it through the war. And then we come to World War II. And in World War II, now, yeah, the Army, the U.S. military kind of woke up, and the Marines and the Army, they did have a military working dog program, but it wasn't too large. They had about 450 dogs, used primarily in the South Pacific. But they were very, very effective. But you know how the U.S. military is. The war ended, everybody came home, and the program just was kind of forgotten. So 5 years later, come Korea, there was no program, except they had one platoon of war dogs, which was the 26th Scout Dog Platoon. And Korea was one of those wars, really, where probably the dogs wouldn't have been that effective anyway. So it was almost like the program was just going to kind of die out of the military, except for the United States Air Force. In the 1950s, the United States Air Force had a lot of property to protect. They had their Air Force bases, the strategic command with the bombers carrying nuclear weapons had to be protected. They had Nike sites, and then of course they had ICBM sites. So the Air Force started a training program at Lackland Air Force Base, and they trained dog handlers. Come Vietnam, the Army was in a similar situation to that, in the sense that the bases in Vietnam were scattered around. Some of them were larger, some of them were smaller. I was at Cam Ranh Bay, and even at Cam Ranh Bay, you think of that as a large support command base, which it was, but a lot of the areas of the command were single areas. For example, the ammo dump. It was off by itself, and it was ringed by barbed wire, and you had to protect that. The field hospital, the same way. It just wasn't one big compound. So they thought that dogs would work out well in Vietnam. So the Army decided, well, what are we going to do? They started with the Air Force, and they started training handlers at Lackland Air Force Base. So some of the early handlers in Vietnam around 1965-66, which is around when they brought dogs over, were training at Lackland. And that was working out fine, except for the fact that the Army was relying heavily on bringing in draftees. And the draftees were only coming in for 2 years, so obviously if they sent them to Vietnam, they were only going to be there for a year. That meant they would train handlers, they would send the handler to Vietnam, the handler would be there for a year, and then he would de-roast back to the States. Then they had to match the handler and the dog back to a new handler. So the problem was a logistic one. They couldn't get the handlers back and forth in an easy manner, so the Army decided that they would have to train dogs themselves. So they started a training facility on the island of Okinawa, which is in the Ryukyu Island chain, which was under Japanese sovereignty. Well, it was under Japanese sovereignty, and then we held it for a while, and then we gave it back to the Japanese. But that kind of brings us to 1967, when I was graduating from high school. And when I came out of high school, my parents, like anybody else, the war was really heating up in Vietnam. They didn't want to see me going off to Vietnam because my brother, who was about 2.5 years older than I am, had already joined the Army and was in the Army. And my brother was very, very smart. He was big on book learning and a little short on common sense. That's a nice way of phrasing it. I think he'd agree with that. But when he graduated from high school, he wanted to go out, he wanted adventure. And he was bored with school. He was smart, so school was easy for him. So my father recognized this. So my father told my brother, he said, well, you either go to a 4-year college or you go in the service. Now, they thought he would take the 4-year college, but not my brother. No, he decided to go in the service. So the first branch he went to was the Marine Corps. But the Marines were picky back then, and this was in '65. He wore glasses, so the Marines said, no, son, go to the Army. We don't need you. They would change that just a few years later. So my brother went into the Army recruiter, and he walked in, and the recruiter said, well, son, what do you want to do? And he said, well, I want to join the Army. And his recruiter says, what do you want to do? And my brother says, well, I want to be infantry. Can you work that out? You can figure the recruiter had a big smile on his face, and he said, absolutely. So they sent my brother through infantry AIT, well, basic training, infantry AIT. They recognized the part that he was rather smart. So they decided, well, you might be a good candidate to go to OCS, Officer Candidate School. So my brother said, okay. But the problem with my brother was he was smart, but he also had a temper. Sometimes he didn't know how to control it. He got through about 5 months of OCS, and then apparently he got in a dispute with one of the trainers, DIs, and there was something about somebody taking a swing or something like that, and he got cashiered out of OCS. But the Army still recognized that he had potential, so they made him E5, Buck Sergeant, and sent him to Korea. Well, he lands in Seoul, and what kind of a job does he get? They give him the job driving around the general. Well, my brother didn't care for that. He wanted adventure. So he told the general, he said, I don't want to drive your fat, what around. I said, I want to do something else. And the general said, well, what do you want to do? And my brother said, well, I'm infantry. And the general said, fine, son, I got the perfect job for you. And they sent him to the DMZ to run patrols. Now, this was 1966, and 65, 66. And back then, Korea was still hot up on the DMZ. We were running night patrols up there, and there were cases where the North Koreans would jump our men. And my brother, who was running the patrols, lost a couple soldiers there. So then, when his tour was finished in Korea, he came back and they stationed him at 6th Army headquarters in the Presidio of San Francisco. And then, he's now got a case of PTSD, which nobody realized at the time. And his job was to escort dead Vietnam veterans back to their homes and perform military funeral honors, which was exactly what he didn't need. So my brother was all over my parents saying, keep my little brother out of the service, keep my little brother out of the service. But his little brother wasn't so smart either. My father, who was a mechanical engineer, thought it would be great to have another engineer in the family, and I was apparently his only hope. So he convinced me I should go to a school called DeVry Technical Institute in Chicago, Illinois. And they were running electrical engineering courses, and that would have been really great for me had I been good at math, but I wasn't. So I lasted about a year, and then one of my good friends, who I'm not sure was a good friend, came to me and said, well, Bob, you can take a few months off from school, you'll lose your deferment, but they'll never catch up to you. You can get back in school in about 6 to 7 months, and you'll be fine. And I thought, well, that sounded like a good idea. And I was 18 and a half now. And I thought, hey, I'm an adult, I can do what I want. So I quit school. My parents weren't happy. But I thought, well, this should be good. And I went to work in retailing, selling, and I really enjoyed that job. And just when I was thinking about going back to school, and maybe working part-time, I got my draft notice. Now you have to understand, this was before the lottery. This was on the old system. So we thought it would take them a long time, but it didn't. So now I had a decision to make, Do I become a Canadian? Well, no. I couldn't talk like them. And then I thought, well, maybe I could join another service. I could join the Navy. But I always got sick on roller coasters, and I'm thinking, ship's going like this. And then there was that crazy uniform they wore. And I thought, bell bottoms and those 13 buttons. I don't know if that's for me, So I thought, no, not the Navy. Of course, I later found out that was the uniform all the women liked. And then I thought of the Air Force, but that was still another 4 years. And I didn't golf. So, you got Air Force? Oh, well. Good friend of mine's in Air Force, career Air Force. So no, I decided that, 2 years, how bad could 2 years be? So I reported to the draft, and I was sent to Fort Campbell, Kentucky for my basic training. And that was typical basic training, and of course, there were a lot of draftees in there. So the thing with draftees was, coming towards the end of your basic training, about a week before, they would post on a wall what your next assignment was going to be, what advanced individual training you were going to go for. And of course, the one that nobody wanted, at least nobody who was being drafted, was 11 Bravo or 11 Charlie, which was light infantry and heavy infantry. And I can remember some guys, when they went down the list and found out they were going infantry, they were literally crying. And I myself was really a little worried about it. And when I looked at my name, I saw the letters and the number 95 Bravo after it. Well, it wasn't 11 Bravo, so I was pretty happy, but I had no idea what 95 Bravo was. So I cornered a sergeant who was walking by, and I said, Sergeant, what's 95 Bravo? And he said, So, well, I think you might be a cook. I said, wow, a cook, that's not too bad. And then I started thinking, but cooks, they get up at like 3 a.m., 4 a.m. And even if I'm a cook, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to go to Vietnam. So I thought maybe he's wrong. So I cornered another guy, and I said, another sergeant, and I said, Sergeant, what's 95 Bravo? And he looked at me with a really disgusted face, and he said, you're a pig, son. I said, what? A pig, Sergeant? He goes, yeah, you're a pig. I said, what does that mean? And he said, you're a cop. You're going to be an MP. I said, wow, that's not too bad. Thank you. I like that. Of course, that still didn't mean that I might not go to Vietnam, but hey, military police, that sounded pretty good. So yes, I went to Fort Gordon for military police training, and then halfway through our advanced training at Fort Gordon, there's lots of scuttlebutt around the Army and rumors, and well, the rumor came down that they needed military police in Germany, and that our graduating class was going to go to Germany. I thought, wow, how lucky can you get? And then the Army says, well, we also need dog handlers. And everybody said, no, you don't want to do that. It's voluntary, but if you're a dog handler, they need the dog handlers in Vietnam, not in Germany. You don't want to volunteer for that. So I said, oh, okay. I'm not going to volunteer for that. Well, the day that they did the demonstration, they even did a demonstration to everybody to get them interested. And the day that they did the demonstration, I was on KP. Because back then you had to do KP. I was literally peeling potatoes the day they did the demonstration, and I thought, this is golden. First time I really loved KP. I'm peeling potatoes, I can't see the demonstration, no way I can volunteer. Of course you know what happened, right? We hear it? Nobody volunteered. And the Army said, well, we need 16 dog handlers. And nobody volunteered, so right down the list, the first 16 people, they're going to be dog handlers. And I said, when I found out that they had done this, I said, but I didn't volunteer. And the sergeant said, son, just go, report for duty, you'll get your chance to volunteer. Okay, and I did. So I got 30 days leave after that, and I spent 3 weeks at home. My brother was living in San Francisco. He was now out of the Army, and still had PTSD, and he'd become a San Francisco hippie. He literally drove a little VW bus, too. I said, okay. So I flew out there, and he was giving me advice, and it was pretty good advice that he gave me. And I remember he took me to his place where he was living. It was kind of a 2-bedroom apartment. It had about 30 people living there. And he's got long hair, the whole shot, beard, And I said, well, he's telling me, he said, Bob, you can report late for duty. You can stay here a couple of weeks. He said, what are they going to do, send you to Vietnam? You're already going. And I said, no, I'm military police. I can't really do that, because I was the good kid. I followed all the rules and the orders. And he took me into his apartment, and he takes me into his bedroom, and he says, we're going to be sleeping in here. I said, well, great. He said, you can throw your duffel bag in the closet here. And he opens up the closet, and hanging there is his Class A uniform, just perfect behind this clear plastic thing. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I said, your friends here that live here, isn't that kind of against, they're kind of anti-Army, aren't they? I said, you really trust them? And he said, oh, they wouldn't touch it. He said, they'd be dead. And I knew then that there was hope for my brother. So anyway, he drove me over to Oakland Army Terminal, which then they took us over to Travis Air Force Base, and we were on our way to Okinawa. So we can go to the next slide. This was the compound that we were training dogs on at Yamatan, Okinawa, in the Ryukyu Islands chain. Now, it looks fairly nice. There's a red flag flying, and what the red flag meant was that there were dog handlers and dogs out in the field. And that became important because a lot of times the dogs were out there and they were doing problems, and these dogs were not muzzled at that time. Next slide. That's the hospital, veterinary hospital, and the orderly room, and you can see the kennels behind. That's where the dogs are. So, next slide. This is the last one of this, but the building in the middle that has, I guess I could use this.
Bob, use the pointer.
This building right here, the Army didn't build. That was an old Japanese bunker from World War II, because this was an area where there was a lot of fighting during World War II when the U.S. came ashore on Okinawa. And that was supposedly was a machine gun bunker. And the story that we had on that was that when the Army got there and they built the dog complex, they discovered there were bodies still in there that they had to remove. So, next slide. Okay, this is about Army wisdom. We'll talk about Army wisdom. The first thing they told us on Okinawa was, your dog is a weapon. And that was true. These dogs were weapons. The second thing they told us was, don't fall in love with your dog. That was impossible. You have to remember that we had to become intimate with these dogs in the sense that we had to know every little facet of them, because it was important in the way they reacted to situations, how they alerted on humans, how they alerted on animals. All those types of things were different. And you had to understand that, and you had to be able to read your dog. And your dog had to know you. Your dog had to have confidence in you. And that was extremely important. And that didn't happen overnight. The third one is, your dog is a killer, which they were. You need to be meaner than your dog. I added the word respect. I think, yes, you did have to be mean, and I think some of the things we did in training back then, which they don't necessarily do now, were maybe considered mean. But your dog had to respect you. There had to be one boss. That had to be the handler. And the dog had to follow you. If the dog was in charge, you were in trouble. Next slide. So, first day you meet your new dog. This is Rex. He's not happy to see you. You can see, it's not a great photo, but you can see the teeth there, and he's in his kennel right now. And your job is to get to know your dog, and your dog's to get to know you, and you're to become friends. He doesn't want to see you, meaning me, he wants to see his last handler, because that was his best buddy. And he's already been through a 2-week period, what we call desensitization, where they would take the dogs coming back from Vietnam. Now remember, the dogs are already trained, because they've been through this before. They know what they're doing. It's really the handler that's being trained. So these dogs are expected to change over to a new handler and love somebody else. I mean, you think about that. If you had every year had a new spouse, maybe some of you would like that, I don't know. We'll assume that would be an issue for you, but so there was a way we did that. So if this was the first day, and you kind of stood there and you kind of talked to the dog, and while you were talking to the dog, he was trying to chew that chain link fence away so that he could get at you and tell you how upset he was, or she, that you weren't his former handler. Next slide. So this is what you did. This is day 2. You would come to the kennels, you would sit outside the kennel run. That's not me, by the way. And you would talk to your dog. You would just sit there and talk to your dog. Or you could sing to your dog, or you could read a book to your dog. Whatever you wanted to do, you just sat there and talked to your dog. And by this time, the dog was tired of chewing up the fence. So the dog would sit there and just look at you. Generally, he sat there and looked at you with his mouth shut, which is never a good sign, because that means you come in there, you're toast. People think dogs with their mouths open are the ones you got to worry about. It's not. It's the ones who are sitting there with their mouths closed. This is the next one. This was my first dog. This was Heidi. And now Heidi has her mouth open, so Heidi looks good. So about the third day, remember these dogs, when they were put away for 2 weeks, they were just fed, they were generally walked, but they weren't given any attention. They were taken care of, but they didn't get any affection, they didn't get any petting, very little recreation. So they, we were trying to get them to a point where we could take the bond away from the former handler and reassert that bond with the new handler. So on about the third or fourth day, when the dog looks like this, sitting in their kennel, the trainer comes along and he goes, "Okay, you can go in with your dog now." And your answer is, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yeah, but don't go near her." Heidi was a female, obviously. So you go in the kennel, and you sit down, and you talk again. And the dog sits over on the other side of the kennel and watches you. And then slowly, either that day or maybe the next day when you're doing the same thing, it's repeat, the dog may come over to you. And if the dog comes over, sniffs you, licks you, leans up against you, lets you pet it, the bond is made. And then the real training starts. Next one. So there's basic training that goes on. I've got to catch up here. The bonding period's over. So then you have obedience training, aggression training, and this is just basic obedience. Again, the dog knows what's going on. I'm the one who's learning everything, but that's a stay command. We taught them all silent commands, or they taught us all silent commands. And this is kind of crazy because when we were out on duty in Vietnam, you wanted to be as quiet as possible. So you didn't want to have to give verbal commands if necessary, so we did also hand commands. Of course, the crazy part is you're doing hand commands in the dark. So you have to be fairly close to the dog to do these commands, but this is basically the stay command. Next one. There was a stand and a sit command. Palm up was to have the dog stand, palm down was sit. So, and there were a few other commands that we did that were hand commands and that were what we termed silent commands. Next one. This is the aggression training. Now, again, a lot of these dogs have been through this before, so again, it's training for the handler. And what we would do is, this was on-leash training. The dogs were not muzzled for this, obviously. There's an agitator here, and the agitator has a sleeve, and they're going up and down the line agitating each dog. And the dog, what they're trying to do here is make sure and reinforce that when the dog bites the sleeve that the dog holds the bite. Because the idea is that dogs tend to bite and then back off. But here we wanted them to bite and hold. And when they bite and hold, the reaction, the normal reaction of somebody is to try and pull away. Well, that tears muscle, that tears bone, and does all kinds of damage. And that's what we were trying to make sure that they were trained to do. But again, these dogs pretty much knew that already. They were what we called retreads. Now, they did also introduce some new dogs that would come in because they had to replace dogs occasionally. Then you had a green handler and a green dog that had to be retrained. Part of the problem with what the Army was doing here with these dogs was that it was noticed down the road that the greatest effect that they could have with the dog and handler was when the bond was secure. When that was a team, and when that team was out working and they knew backwards and forwards, they were really an efficient team. Problem was, it took almost 2 to 3 months of working with a dog to really know all the facets of the dog. So when you got a new handler coming in, if you had 3 or 4 new handlers coming in, they weren't going to be really productive with those dogs until they spent enough time with them. Today, and of course you'll see this with police forces as well, they made a dog with a handler and they are for life. They don't take the handler away, or the dog away, I'm sorry, from the handler and give it to somebody else. So like on police departments, they'll retire a dog maybe after 7 years or 8 years, and that dog stays with the police officer. And the Army is tending to do this now as well. So, next one. This is just working down the road, down the aisle, so next one. And then down to the end. There were a couple other things we did with these dogs also. We had the same kind of line agitation, but we would put muzzles on them, and then we would literally go and we would fight with the dog. The agitator would. So, my dog being a retrain or retread, and I adapted to it fairly quickly. So you would fight with the dog. The dog would be muzzled, and you'd take your fists like this, and you'd come up to the dog, and you'd kind of bat the dog on the side of the head. Well, that dog is moving its head like this to try and take, off your wrist, but he's muzzled. So technically, I shouldn't be hurt, but the dogs had a habit of getting their canine teeth on the outside of the muzzle, and I still have a couple little scars from that, probably rightfully so. The other thing we did, and I always thought this was kind of horrendous, but we used to sometimes take a choke chain and we'd ball it up into a ball and we'd tape it with masking tape, and then just to really irritate the dog, we would take that and toss it from about 3 feet away and hit them in the flank here. And of course, they hated that, but that was just all the agitation part of it. This is what the sleeve looked like at the end of the day. That was a fairly new sleeve when they started out that day of agitation, and that's when the dogs ripped into it. This was another, what we called perp takedown. And what's happening here is, in this case, the dog is muzzled, and the handler is leaning over telling the dog, watch. And then, next slide, the handler goes over to make the arrest or to put the perp in custody, and the dog is just sitting there watching very closely. The minute that the perp attacks the handler, you can already see the dog launching. And then the dog takes him down. And then you go over and you praise your dog. They did a great job. Now, we did several other type of what we called off-leash attack training. So this is what we call a scent cone. Now if you took that and you laid it flat, that would be, of course, the way it would be in the field. The agitator was about 30 yards out at the apex of the triangle. The dog and handler would be walking along the bottom of the triangle. And this, in this case, the dogs, of course, were unmuzzled. And the wind at the back of the agitator would cause what we call a scent cone. And the scent would drift down this way. So as the dog walked along and the handler walked along here, we waited until the dog picked up the scent. Now, as soon as the dog picked up the scent, you'd raise your hand to tell the trainer that you had a human alert, because we couldn't see the agitator. He was far enough out that we couldn't see him. And then they would give you permission to release your dog on attack. And then the dog would follow the scent cone in, because as the scent cone came down, it weakened, but as the dog followed the cone up, the scent up, it would get stronger, and the dog would go and basically zero in on the agitator. The thing with this situation was, if you were the agitator, you had to make sure that you knew each of the dogs that were in your unit. And I did this. I was the agitator on several of these. Every dog was different. Some dogs would take and they would follow that scent cone right in directly at you at a full clip, running as fast as they could. And they would come in and hit the end of that sleeve. So you had to make sure that you had your feet firmly planted when that dog hit the end of that sleeve. And in this case, we were wearing a full agitation suit, not just the sleeve. Some of the dogs would come in and they would go airborne about 6 feet from you. So then you had to raise the sleeve up and get ready for that dog to hit the end of that sleeve and bring him down. And then there were some crafty dogs that once they got the scent, they knew where the agitator was. So they would try and sneak around behind you. That was an issue simply because you're in this agitation suit and your mobility is restricted. So you needed to turn around, you needed to make sure where that dog was coming from. That's why it was good to know how all of the dogs in the unit, what they might do. I never saw an agitator lose his feet or fall over, but when you have a dog traveling at the speed that they can run, it's a force really hitting the end of that sleeve. Go back up if you would. I'm going to tell you another, no, go back. Yep, stay there. This was in Okinawa. It was the last, and I might have a little trouble getting through this, so. It was the last problem that we were going to have before we graduated. And I was the first handler up on the line, and the agitator was a good friend of mine. Now, we're going to break away for a second and go forward several years. I'm out of the Army, and I'm at home, and I get a phone call. And it's my buddy. It was the buddy who was the agitator that day. And we start talking and everything else, and everything's great. And then he says to me, he said, Bob, you remember that time, that last agitation problem we did? I was the agitator, and you were the first handler on the line. And I go, no. What are you talking about, It was just a problem. And he goes, no, you remember. And all of a sudden I did. It was just like, I didn't hear another word he said. It just came, my eyes just remembered. It just came over in front of me. And what had happened that day was there was a bushes right about off over here. And Heidi and I were first ones up on the line. We were coming down the line. We got about halfway, and Heidi hit the end of the leash hard. And with a dog, you're supposed to be able to look down between off the top of their head between their ears, and that's generally the direction of where the agitator or where the infiltrator might be. So Heidi was really just going this way. So I raised my hand, and I got permission to send the dog off on attack. And I thought, well, that's unusual, but I thought, maybe she's picking up a heavy scent here, and she's then going to go in on the agitator. She takes off. I let her loose on attack. She takes off like a bullet. And these bushes here, she gets to the bushes, she goes through the bushes. Now I'm about 20 yards behind her, trying to catch up with her. And as she goes through the bushes, about a second after she's through the bushes, I hear this high-pitched scream. I thought, oh my God, what does she have? Now I'm really running. And unbeknownst to me, the trainer heard it as well, and he's running like crazy. I get to the bushes, I punch through the bushes, and there's Heidi. And lying on the ground is a little Okinawan schoolboy, probably the age of 10 or 12 years old. And he's screaming. Heidi has him by his calf. There's some blood, obviously. And he's trying to get away from her, screaming. And I didn't think I would be able to get to them soon enough to get her off, because I knew that Heidi was going to go for his throat next. So I did what I shouldn't have done. I yelled, Heidi, no! Heidi did what she shouldn't do. She picked up her head, let loose of the boy, and she looked back at me, and if you could see disgust on the face of a dog, she was disgusted. And I don't blame her, because she expected to be praised. She was doing exactly what she was trained to do. But I think she also knew that this wasn't Vietnam. How do I know that? Well, dogs sense a smell. Okinawans probably smell different than Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese, certainly their odor was different from ours. And that's why we didn't worry too much when the dogs were around us, because we all smelled very similar because of our diets. And the Vietnamese, smelled totally different. So I'm looking down. Heidi picks up her nose, picks up the scent again of the agitator, and takes off. So I'm thinking, this is happening in a matter of seconds, and I'm thinking, well, I got to do something for this kid. And I started to move towards the kid. All of a sudden, behind me was the trainer, and he punched me in the shoulder and said, "Handler, your dog's on attack. Get after your dog. I got this." And I was never so happy to hear those words. And I took off after Heidi. A few days before we left for Vietnam, they came to me and they said that the little boy was going to be okay. You have to keep in mind that an adult German Shepherd dog has about 700 pounds per square inch of pressure in their jaws. She could have ripped open an artery. She could have probably broken that little boy's leg. The fact that she didn't was just marvelous, actually, when you think about it. So they also said that the Okinawan authorities wanted the Army to turn over the dog. And of course, that's Army property. They weren't going to do that. And the Army told the authorities, they said, well, these dogs are totally taken care of. You know, you don't have to worry about rabies. But I suspect that that poor boy had to go through rabies shots as well. So he told his parents that he liked to play hooky from school occasionally, and he liked to go watch the dog soldiers. That's what he called us, the dog soldiers. So he was probably not playing hooky too much after that. The sad part was everybody thought I was great because I was blooded and they weren't. You know, it's crazy what young guys do, but what are you going to say? So, next one. So, we graduated, and we got on a C-130, and we headed for Cam Ranh Bay, South Vietnam. Next one. Now, Cam Ranh Bay is right about here. It's was in 2 Corps. And the thing about Cam Ranh Bay that made it so special was prior to the U.S. Army getting there, it was just a fishing village. But it was a big natural harbor there, a big bay, and it was just perfect, and the location was just perfect. So for the Army, so they established a fairly large base there where they could bring in a lot of supplies and everything else and supply 2 Corps and even parts of I Corps and 3 Corps. Gotta catch up on my notes here. Okay, we can go to the next one. Okay, so we arrived in Vietnam, and I was assigned to the 981st Military Police Sentry Dog Unit. There were 2 primary Sentry Dog companies in Vietnam. The first one, the original one, was the 212th, which was down more in around Saigon, and they did work in 4 Corps in the Delta and in the Area 3. The Sentry 981st was all 2 Corps and up on to I Corps. And then the Marines had dogs as well, but their dogs pretty much, they trained their own, so they weren't really part of the Army's. Next one. Okay, time for more Army wisdom. One is, your dog will save your life twice. Once you'll know about it, and one time you won't. And then finally, I love this one, they told us never, and I emphasize never, release your dog on an off-leash attack, because the sappers will kill the dog and then they're coming for you. Because the sapper teams usually came at least 3-4 men. And if they got in, they would, and you let the dog go, one of them might get taken down by the dog, but they would then take the dog out, and then it would be you against them. So all that off-leash training that we did was somewhat for naught because we didn't do any of that. In fact, the crazy part about the Army was that we wore radios, which was kind of nice, and if we had alerts when we were on post, we had to call the sergeant of the guard to ask for permission to fire. The only time we could fire without permission was if the sappers got through the second concertina wire and were directly threatening us. Then we could open up and we could fire. Now, the first one, I'd have to say I probably can think of a time that possibly the dog saved my life. It was Rex. We were on the ammo dump, and we were looking, on the ammo dump we had lights that were looking at, that shone out onto the perimeter, but they were spaced far between. There were a lot of dark spots, and bushes apparently aren't nice to me because in the middle of the kill zone between the two concertina wires there was this huge bush, and it had been there for a long time. It had never been a problem, but on this one particular night, Rex and I were walking along the path behind the wire, and all of a sudden Rex hits in a really hard alert, and it was an alert that I knew he had humans, not animals, because if I had animals, Rex would kind of growl and dance a little bit at the end of the leash, but if it was a human, it would just be a good solid pull right at the end. And when he did that, we were getting close to that bush, and what I heard, because it was fairly quiet out there, I heard this metallic click. And to this day, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what that click was. I don't think it was a bolt going forward, but I think it might have been a switch going from safety to shoot. But that's what it sounded like. And when that happened, I went flat on my chest, and Rex looked back at me, and I gave him the motion or the signal to also get down, and we stayed that way, and he was really agitated for a while, and then about 5 minutes, 10 minutes after that, he dropped the alert and he was just lazing around, and that was it for the night. But the next morning we went out and we examined the wire, and the outer concertina wire had been cut, and it was pretty obvious that somebody had come through there and had been behind that bush at that point in time. So, was I in danger? Well, maybe. Who knows? But anyway, next one. Okay, this is guard mount before we went on out on guard. This was the guard mount we held when there was somebody important around, like the CO. A commanding officer or a guest or somebody like that. Everybody looked really nice and neat and in line and very military. Next slide. This is typically how it looked. Yeah, smoking cigarettes, standing around. But the interesting thing about this slide is the guys in back are not in helmets or flak jackets or anything like that, because there were two shifts that we worked. One was 6 p.m. to midnight, and then midnight to 6 a.m. So we walked a 6-hour shift. Now you might wonder, and on the guard mounts, both would shifts would stand for guard mount, because then we got, just like the police do, we got briefed on what was going on, if there was any activity in the area, and what we could expect. So if you look at these guys, though, what we had to carry out there, you see, on his helmet, he's got goggles. Cameron Bay was really very, very sandy. It was almost like being in the desert, because it was a peninsula and it was windswept, and the Central Highlands in that part, right, we were right on the South China Sea. It was just like being in the desert. So when the wind kicked up, that would get in your eyes. And that was hard on the dogs. And we sometimes then would wear goggles. But also, we took out about 17 magazines of M16 ammunition with us. And the reason we carried that so much is because when you were on post, you were pretty much by yourself. There might be, on any given post, maybe 2 or 3 handlers, but we were spaced out quite a distance. So, and we were told, unless it was absolutely, the other handler was in absolute trouble, to stay at our post. Because, if you went to help the other guy, then somebody could be coming in where the other person was. So we carried quite a bit of ammunition. We carried muzzles. We had to carry the muzzles because we had to truck the dogs out to post. A truck would take us to the kennels, which were not near the barracks where we stayed. Then we would have to muzzle the dogs, put them on the trucks, and then they would take us out to the posts. And we also carried the dog's attack collar. Over on the table here is Heidi's attack collar. And when the dogs were were off duty, they wore a choke chain. And they wore that choke chain all the time unless they were doing agitation problems or we were going on duty. When we got on duty, when we got out to our posts, the first thing we did was change the dog from the collar, or from the choke chain to the collar. And when we did that, it was like night and day. It was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Thank you. This is the collar here, and it's pretty heavy, and it has to be because of its use. Now, I have it, these collars stayed with the dogs for life, and the reason I have Heidi's is because after about 4 or 5 months with Heidi developed a blood-borne disease over there. And the Army knew about it, but they didn't have any cure for it. And once the dog contracted the disease, there was nothing they could do but euthanize the dog. So Heidi was taken away from me, and it was the first time that I cried over a dog. It was Heidi. And I was just, I mean, that was my best partner. And that's when I got Rex. And then I had to go through a whole other period of getting used to a new dog. So that I was really off duty for 2 weeks, as far as 2-3 weeks, as far as walking a dog. The other thing we carried out there was what we called our ditty bags, the bags at their feet there. And we carried a lot of stuff in there. We had to carry things for the dog. We had to carry water, we had to carry some food and that type of thing. And we only worked a 6-hour shift, not because of the handlers, they don't care about us. The what we call straight leg MPs who were doing actual police duty, they did a 12-hour shift. We did a 6-hour shift because that's all the dogs could do. After 6 hours, the dog was shot. Now, I'm sure many of you in this room are dog owners, and you know your dog. I mean, your dog will have periods where a lot of activity, and then, hey, they got to rest, you know, it's time for a nap. Well, these dogs weren't any different from that either. And 6 hours was about the length of time that they could go, as far as that goes. Next one. Cameron was had a full veterinary hospital, and this was it, the 176th Veterinary Detachment. Any dogs that were throughout 2 Corps would be, if they were wounded or if they were sick, they would be brought here to Cameron Bay. We also had Snoopy back there too, you can see in the background. And then these kennels were built back in '68, so that was actually just, I believe, before Ted. Next one. Okay, this is my second dog. This is Rex. And really, I only put this picture in here because it gives you a good idea of what the muzzles looked like on the dogs. They were pretty strong, fairly well made. And they were large enough to allow the dog to breathe, because dogs have to be able to get their tongue out. That's how they control their heat. It was one thing that the Army was always concerned about, was using dogs in hot climates like that. But we found that if we pretty much kept the dogs' coats shorter and kept them fully hydrated, it usually wasn't a problem. Next one. This is one of my favorite pictures of Rex. And you can see the choke chain that he has on there. He was in a good mood that day. Well, he was usually in a good mood with me anyway. Okay. That's also Rex. My buddy had the camera, and he didn't like the fact my buddy had the camera. So this is what you could have coming at you. I thought it was kind of impressive. And you know, we think about the fact that these dogs were trained to bite and hold, and I mean, they were weapons. Next one. This is dog dipping. Because over there were a lot of things like mites and ticks and everything else that these dogs could pick up. They had to be treated. And I believe once a month we did this. The vet techs would fill these tanks with a malthion solution, and the dogs had to be dipped into that solution. You can see in the background this dog here. What they're doing to him is they had to put a salve in their eyes to protect their eyes, because the dog had to be totally immersed in this solution, and it stunk, and it was this white solution. The fun of the day was to try to stay dry yourself. Dip the dog, but you wanted to stay dry. Now there was a trick to that. And the trick, it was a fairly simple one. You would pick the dog up under its chest and take its tail, flip its tail down and pick it up under its rear. And then the idea was you'd have to flip the dog in. So what the trick was you had to take your hands, turn them over and grab the outside paw, and then come up to the tank and then flip the dog, and then the dog would go in on its back and it would get totally immersed, and then it would come out. If you didn't do that, these dogs knew it was coming and they didn't like it. So the minute you picked it up, you had a wiggling, even though the dog loved you and trusted you, you had a wiggling dog. Well, you know what that dog did? It did like what kids do. The paws went like this, and then you had the paws on either side of the tank. And you were trying to get the dog in, and the dog's not going in. That's when you got really wet. So the trick was, yeah, you flipped them in. And of course, when we had a new handler who had never done it before, we didn't tell him the trick. It was fun. But here, he's doing it fairly well. The dog's going to flip over and it's going in. And the next slides are just kind of showing us. They made a pretty good splash. He got a little wet anyway. Next one. And then the dogs would climb out. Now, as soon as the dog climbed out, you know what he wanted to do. Shake off. Yeah, exactly. He wanted to shake himself off. So then you're trying to get away from him. And he's trying to come towards you and shake around you. It's almost like he wants to punish you for what he's done. Next one. This was called Dong Batin. It was a chopper base, and it was about 20 miles from Cam Ranh Bay, from the Maine. And we walk dogs here. This is a chopper here. I know this is hard to see. This is a chopper here. Another chopper there, and another chopper there. We had dogs walking the perimeter, and we also had dogs that walked up and down the flight line. So I've always liked things that fly. So this was a post that once I had seniority and I could decide where I wanted to walk, I always wanted to go to Dong Batin. And as a senior handler, the Army liked that because they wanted experienced people on this, because this was one that tended to draw attention from the VC. So the interesting thing that happened one night was I wasn't on the flight line, but I was on the perimeter, and it was like this base was at the bottom of like a U, and then off to our right I was told there was a Special Forces training center where Special Forces was training ARVN soldiers in Special Forces tactics. And then over to the left was another compound, which was a ROK, or a Republic of Korea Army base. And I met some of those Koreans. They were pretty crazy guys. But there was one night where I was told this, and I witnessed most of it. The apparently Special Forces camp had graduated a class of ARVN soldiers who decided to come back one night and test out what they'd learned on their former instructors. So off to my right, I'm on the perimeter, and off to my right, up over here, I start hearing a lot of small arms fire and some tracers down low. And I'm just hunkering down, and I'm thinking, well, how's this going to affect me? You know, is something going to come at me? And then the Koreans never the Koreans never wanted to miss a fight. So the Koreans decide to open up. So they're shooting across in front of me, and I'm just watching tracers go overhead and go back and forth. And that lasted for about 10, 15 minutes, and then everything calmed down and quieted down. So I never found out what happened, but the night passed. You can go to the next slide. And well, that was before the sun went down. This was the perimeter. Obviously, that was what we called the flare ship. And they sent the flare ship up at night, and that ship flew all around Cam Ranh Bay, and it was up there. If there was any attacks on any perimeters, any place, they would call in the flare ship. They had a minigun mounted in it, and they would take care of business as far as that went. That was also probably, I almost went to Long Bin jail because of this. I shouldn't tell you this because if there's anybody from the Army CID or something, I could go to jail. But I had a bet with the sergeant of the guard, who was a good friend of mine, Paul Ripley from Paul Mooney, I'm sorry, from Ripley, New York, who would get to fly in a Huey first. And he was sergeant of the guard this night, and I was walking up the flight line. I was doing the flight line, and the flare ship came in and it sat down, and I kind of walked up to there, and these guys were real interested in my dog. I couldn't believe it, you know, helicopter guys who I thought were fantastic, they're interested in me. So they said, well, the captain was flying the thing, and he said, well, handler, he said, does your dog know any tricks? And I said, well, yeah. I said, he knows a trick. He said, well, show us. So somebody had taught Rex, I didn't. I'd have Rex sit high on his hinds, and then if you went bang, Rex would fall over. I found this out one night. I got really angry at him, and I said, Rex, sit high, because dogs, that's hard for them to do. I said, sit high, and I kept him that way. And I said, I ought to bang, and he fell over. So I showed that trick to him, and the captain says, well, handler, has your dog ever flown in one of these? So, no, sir, I don't know, I don't think so. And he goes, well, you think you'd like to? Oh, I said, yeah, that'd be kind of cool. So I said, well, hop in. So he did. I said, I told him, I said, well, I could be with this dog. He said, bring him. So we did. They had a seat in the middle against the back bulkhead. I took off my steel pot, and they gave me a flight helmet and the whole shot, and they put me into the comm system, and we take off, and we're going, and they asked me, they said, well, is there any place you want to go? And I said, I'm not flying this thing. You know, and they said, well, let's go over and see the field hospital. So we fly over to the field hospital, and they said, well, handler down there, that's the field hospital. And I said, yes, sir, I know. I said, we have a handler down there. He said, where? I said, along the beach. He said, well, let's go down and look at him. And he did. He took it down, and we flew along the beach. You know, I'm trying to wave to the guy, but he couldn't really see me. So now I'm thinking, you know, this is starting to wear off, and I'm beginning to think, well, you know, you've left your post. If we get hit tonight with anything and you're not there, this isn't going to look good on your record. So about the time I was going to suggest to the captain that maybe we ought to go back, he says, well, we're going over to Air Force now. Air Force? Why are we going there? You know, because Cameron had a big, major runway and everything else there. He said, well, we're going for coffee. I said, okay, we'll go for coffee. We fly over to Air Force, he lands, and they said, well, so you coming with us? And I said, not with this dog. and he said, well, tie the dog up to the skid. And I said, no, sir, I can't do that. I'll have to wait here. You guys go have your coffee. And they were only gone about 5 minutes. They brought their coffee back. And then we took off, and then they got some kind of report from one of the perimeters that they had some action going on. So he asked me, he said, you know, we're going to open up on this perimeter handler. He said, you ever seen a minigun work from this angle? No. and I had a flight helmet on, and when they opened up with that minigun, my ears were just, I mean, the concussion from that was just brutal. And I looked down at my dog, and the dog was in agony, and I had to lean down and cup my hands over the dog's ears. So Rex wasn't real happy about that flight. But we made it back. We came back to Dong Batin. We landed, and I got out, and everything looked okay. And I thought, oh, man, you know, I got away with this. And standing down at the end of the runway is Paul Mooney in the Jeep. And I walk up to him, and he said, where the H have you been? And I said, well, you owe me $50. He said, what? I said, I got to fly in one of these before you. And he said, I could court-martial you. And I said, yeah, but you won't, because we're friends. And this wouldn't look good for you either. And I got away with that. But that was probably, it's one of my favorite memories of my time there, and it was a hell of an experience. And one of the things they did, and Ray, you could probably appreciate this, through this entire flight, the bay doors, they kept them open. And he took it in a fast lean over like this, and Rex and I are looking out the bay door. You know, we're not sure what's holding us in, but obviously the centrifugal force and everything else. Of course, we had seatbelt on, and they were great guys. I really enjoyed them. Next one. This is Dawn at Dong Batin, so we made another night. Next one. This is a kind of a John Wayne picture of me. This is Heidi, so it was early there. This is the ammo dump, guard tower. This back here was a bunker. They did have bunkers along the route for us handlers. If we were attacked, we could go in the bunker. But you never wanted to go in the bunker because you didn't know what was living in that bunker. And there were a lot of things that were probably living in there. So we stayed out of there. Next one. This is the ammo dump, and this is, probably for you folks way back there, this is just a smudge, but this was the perimeter. This was the lights that we walked on. This was the post here, and this was the light shining out on no man's land. This blue streak is just a reflection on the lens. But we would walk behind these lights, but again, there were areas that were darkened, and that's where Charlie used to, if he was coming in, he would come in there. Now, not all of the posts were lit up like that, but the dogs were very, very effective as far as that went. So, next one. Being a military police officer, I got to do some regular MP duties, and this is another kind of John Wayne shot. That's an M1 1911 45, which you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with. The remarkable thing about this picture that all people point out to me is how skinny my ankles were. So the name for this picture is Skinny Ankles. Next one. I did do some convoy duty, and once I was on that, I was sorry. Why am I doing this? But I did it. This is what we called a V100. I'm not sure if those were 30 cals or 50 cals. I'm not quite certain. But there was usually one of these at the beginning of the convoy and one at the end. Next one. And then I rode in one of these, which was a gun truck with an M60 machine gun mounted up here. And I'm not sure what was behind the tarp here, and I didn't really ask. Next one. This is for my Navy friends. How many Navy men do we have out there tonight? Well, good. This was taken in Hong Kong Harbor. It's a U.S. destroyer, I believe. I don't know what class, but 1970, so maybe some of you Navy guys know. I don't know. Next. And for my Air Force friends. B-52. B-52, and there's another one back here and another one behind it. This was taken in Okinawa off at Kadena Air Force Base. And they were departing for parts unknown, but I would have to believe that they were on their way to North Vietnam on bombing runs. So, kind of, what time is it? Quarter to 9? I got a couple of minutes more?
Yeah, wrap that up and then we'll have you give your Q&A.
Okay,
5 minutes.
just a couple, yep, that's all I got. So one of the other things too, which was a little unsettling, was the dogs were so effective that the Vietnamese, the VC had put out a bounty on dog handlers and dogs, and the dog was worth $10,000 US if they killed one. The handler was worth $5,000 US. I know. And, you know, I don't get no respect. I don't know if they had a 2-for-1 deal, but yes, if they could prove that they killed a dog or a handler, they could get that kind of money. It's estimated, and I read this, that were it not for having dogs in Vietnam, that there probably would be about 10,000 more names on the wall in Washington, D.C. The dogs were that effective. And not only were there sentry dogs in Vietnam, but there were scout dogs who operated with the infantry. Those German Shepherds were used as sentry dogs and scout dogs because they're air sniffers. They sniffed the air around them. Labrador Retrievers were also used, but they're ground sniffers. And they used those as detector dogs for going into mines and for the tunnels. And they were very effective, of course, in that as well. There were, I believe, and I've seen this number change a little bit, 294 dog handlers were killed in action over about an 8-year period. 350 dogs were killed in action. And throughout about an 8-year period when dogs were active in Vietnam, that was about 10,000 dog handlers. And if you do the math, the percentage of dog handlers killed is about equal to the total number of soldiers' names on the wall in Washington, D.C. So I think it's close to like 2%. 4,000 dogs served. Fewer than 200 returned stateside. They didn't want to bring them back stateside at the time because they didn't think the dogs could be desensitized from the training. The other problem was, of course, the diseases that the dog had. They didn't want to introduce that into the general population. So when the Army left, when the treaty was signed, the dogs were considered surplus equipment, and the Army turned some of the dogs over to the ARVN forces, and they didn't know what to do with them. And the others were just either let go or given away. And the Vietnamese ate dogs, so we assumed that a lot of dogs were probably caught and then eaten. And I think that personally is deplorable. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my story, and I thank you very much for listening.
Hold on, folks. We have a Q&A time, but I have a question for you, Bob. First of all, saying farewell to your Rex, was that tough? Did you know, what warning, did you know days, weeks, hours ahead that you were leaving and then you had to do the farewell, or how did they sensitize you to doing that? Well,
yeah, I had about a week's notice, when I'd be going home. So, yeah, then Rex was taken away. And yeah, that was the second time I cried.
Okay, next question. At what age does the Army start training these dogs, or were they already trained stateside or in other military facilities around the world? So give us a background on that.
No, most of those dogs were donated by the civilian population. And they came to us untrained, and like I said, the raw dogs would have to train right along with the handlers, and that was about a six-week training period. Now, was the dog immediately effective? Probably not. It probably took time. But training went on. Once we got to Vietnam, we worked nights, but during the daytime, we had other duties too. We would go to the kennels. We would work with the vet techs to clean the kennels and take care of the dogs. Because the vet techs and the veterinarian, they were marvelous. They were fantastic. They did a great job. They were heroes too. And we would also work with the dogs and do training ourselves. So,
did you have any other breeds other than German Shepherds? Do you have Dobermans or Rottweilers or any of those?
No Rottweilers, mostly Shepherds, but there were some funny looking Shepherds there, I have to say. It all depended on the aggression of the dog. When the Army took possession of the dogs, they would test them for aggression. The most aggressive dogs would go to the Sentry dogs because they were going to be trained for aggression. Less aggressive dogs went to the infantry for scout dogs. And the scout dogs didn't have to be as aggressive. They had to have a good nose on them because the scout dogs could sense booby traps. And they used the scout dogs as points in an infantry patrol rather than just putting a guy out there. Because the dog could sense the enemy long before the enemy could see the patrol.
Okay.
And most infantry patrols loved having the dogs.
Question for you. Those dogs, could they be with other dogs, or would they fight immediately? Have you ever had a situation where they could kind of pal around, or would they just go?
Yeah, actually I did. I've got some pictures of that, which I didn't particularly think to bring because they were just regular photographs. But a couple of times I was on post with my buddy, and the dogs were they didn't have muzzles on, and the dogs are sniffing each other, and they're together because we're a tight community. And after a while, the dogs know, okay, this is my buddy dog. These guys are okay. You know, they sense that. It's kind of amazing, really.
We're going to open up the question and answer period. We have some dog lovers here, and let's take the microphone out. Raise your hand if you've got a question. Not too late. Mr. Fox, where are you? You are. Be right with you.
Oh, okay.
You have a question, you stand up for us. You're a first-time attender. You are a Vietnam veteran, and you were over there pulling howitzers and so forth. You told me you have lifelong dog experience. Will you tell a word or two with the question for him?
Oh, I train dogs since I've been 12 years old.
Got me beat.
I'm surprised I didn't become a handler.
The light has to go up to your chin.
And my patrol, I drove a 155 self-propelled howitzer. You don't need every man to, man it.
Sure.
I used to take the patrols out. And one patrol, we had a female dog with us. We, maybe 1 in 7 times, would get a dog.
Yep.
This sounds hard to believe, but we're walking and this area is really infested with Vietcong. And I hear him yell, the handler of the dog were on my right side. The squawk box went off. That's a phone, but it's on their back. And I'm supposed to kneel, and the guy said, I kept walking. Dog broke away, crossed my whole platoon, laid in front of me. In front of me there was a wire.
Yep.
I would have tripped that wire. It was a tank mine.
Yep.
I'd have pulled the whole squad up. So I owe my life and probably 18 other guys because of a dog.
Yep.
And I've always had shepherds. I wish I could have brought Grizz with me. He's a big, beautiful dog. His daddy's back in Germany.
How many dogs have you had?
I've had 11 German shepherds.
Wow. That's a lot.
But God bless the dogs and the handlers.
Question. Anybody else?
Hey, Ken, can I say one last thing?
Wait. 1 second. You say, no, you are.
Are the dogs neutered, or are they just left the way they are?
You want to know if the dogs are neutered?
You know, that's a good question, and I think they probably were left the way they were because that increased the aggression. One other thing about the dogs had rank. The dogs were considered to be corporals, and that made them NCOs. So if the handler abused the dog, they could bring you up on charges. So I had to say, yes sir, to my dog.
Did they ever get promoted?
No, they were permanent corporals.
Question over here.
On
Yeah, Ray.
the situation where the young man was attacked by a
Yes.
dog, was that not inside of a secure compound? How did he get there?
No, where we trained, the only secure part of the compound was what I showed you there. We trained out in fields, and those fields were accessible. In fact, the reason that bunker was there was that was a kamikaze air base, and the Japanese flew kamikaze flights out of that. And we would be training with the dogs. We'd be running through this tall grass, and all of a sudden it felt like you were running on concrete. And you'd look down, and you were on a portion of the old runway. And the weeds and just everything had just grown up through it. So, yeah, he shouldn't have been there, but he was.
Question here.
Hey, Bob. Troy Williamson, he runs the dog-to-dog tags now up in Plymouth. And I'm looking for a comparison. He said he was a contractor in Afghanistan. He said he trained 35 or 40 dogs in like a 10-year period or something like that. How does that compare to your time frame and how you had to train them to their fullest capabilities?
Well, I mean, that's quite a while, but the way a service dog that is being trained, to take care of a veteran with PTSD or something of that nature requires a whole lot more training than what these dogs were getting. We were emphasizing natural tendencies that these dogs already had. aggression, we were accenting that aggression, bringing it more out into the surface. They had to be trained in, to respond to commands and that type of thing. And they had to respond to commands without treats. We didn't use treats because if you're in a combat situation, you may not have any treats. You can say, attack, and he goes, well, let's have the treat. Sorry, don't have one. So they had to operate out of, love or duty.
Yeah, he actually trained him as a handler over there to do the same thing. That's why I was wondering that now he trains service dogs for veterans of PTSD, but over there he was training actual military dogs as a handler to do similar things with the Marines.
The thing about the dogs was that we had to accent their natural abilities. A human being has 5 million olfactory senses. A dog has about 300 million. So let me put this into something. If you walk into a room and somebody's making stew, you get in there and you go, oh, that smells really good. Your dog comes in and your dog can tick off everything that's in that stew. He can smell it or she can smell it all. He could tell you, if they could talk, they could tell you exactly what ingredients were in there. That's how good their smell is. There's been cases where handlers have worked with a dog in like Afghanistan or something like that, and they had to leave the dog over there, and then they came back, and their appearance has changed. And the dog has fairly decent eyesight, fairly good hearing, but the dog didn't recognize the person until the person got close enough for the dog to smell him, and then that dog just lit up and went right for him, because then the dog knew who it was.
More questions?
Yes?
Could you address the issue of modern warfare and whether or not dogs are used as frequently, such as in the IDF and with the infrared and all those modern technologies?
Oh, I think there's plenty of jobs for dogs in the modern military. I've seen pictures. I've seen pictures today of dogs that jump out of airplanes with their handlers, airborne. They have the dog strapped to their chest, and they parachute out. That was something I did back in my day. I didn't even know you could do. But the senses that a dog has to be able to alert on all kinds of different substances. The infantry also had what they called tracker dogs. They were a little bit different than scout dogs, but they also operated with the infantry. Their job was if a infantry company encountered the enemy, like the VC, and then the VC dropped the attack, they wanted to find out where the VC had their headquarters. So the tracker dogs were used. The tracker dogs were all usually ground sniffers, Labrador retrievers, and they would use those dogs to follow the VC back to where their headquarters were so they could, take them out. And the reason they didn't use bloodhounds were too noisy. But Labrador retrievers could do the same thing, but they were silent.
Another question back here.
Let's go to present today.
Pardon, Ron?
All the dogs are trained today. As far as the police, maybe the sheriff can help.
Well, a lot of dogs today come from Germany. In fact, a lot of the police have to learn the commands in German because the dogs are trained in Germany. In fact, with us, we didn't train our dogs to stop an attack. If our dogs attacked somebody, the only way we could get the dog off was to manually go in and take the dog off, which was dangerous for us because dogs attack motion. And if we were going to come in and I was going to pull a dog off somebody, if I reached around, the dog would bite me, he'd attack me because that motion coming. So what we had to do is we had to come up behind the dog, put our hands like this on the back of the dog's neck, slide him around, and literally choke the dog off. That's how we got him off. There was no out command. But if a dog, in the United States, the dog knows German commands, you're probably in pretty good shape because most people don't know German.
Another question.
What was the distance on your triangle? What was the distance?
About 30 yards to the tip.
Pardon me.
I have three what I think are easy questions. Did Rex ever forgive you for the helicopter ride?
Oh, yeah,
And did you have pets after you came back?
I did.
Okay.
We had a German Shepherd when my wife and I were first married, and it was a female named Cinnamon. And then later on we had Hector, who was a black lab mix.
And did you meet her after you got back, or did you know her before?
Fortunately, she met me after I got back.
Well, you had,
Hold it close to your chest.
oh, okay, yeah. We did have Cinnamon on hand commands.
Yeah, I taught Cinnamon hand commands.
So Hector was a total marshmallow, but, yeah.
Cinnamon also pissed me off one day, pardon the fun. And our first house, you could run through the living room, you could run through the dining room, and then run through the kitchen. And attached to the kitchen was the porch going out the back, and I just got really angry at her. And I grabbed a choke chain and I balled it up, and I'm chasing her, and the back door was open. So I came around, she shot out the back door, and I heaved the choke chain at her. I lost my temper. Missed her, went through the window. I got what I deserved.
I just want to know, after your brother went through his hippie stage,
Yes.
how did he turn out? Was everything
Well,
okay?
thank you for asking. No, he still lives in San Francisco, but he went back in the reserves and he put in 20 years. He was deployed to
Germany.
no, it wasn't. Well,
Bosnia.
Bosnia. He was, and when he was in Bosnia,
in Germany.
Well, he was in Germany. They were on their way to Bosnia. They went out one night to have a couple drinks, and it was early winter, and the roads were real slick, and he got hit by a car, and then he was he was done. They had to take him back to Germany. And he was in the hospital in Germany for about 2 weeks, and then they brought him back stateside. But he was still able to complete 20 years.
And he did jump school.
Yeah, and my brother, this is the stupidity of my brother. Well, I'm sorry to you, the airborne guys, but he was attached to a special forces unit, and he wasn't special forces himself, but to stay in the unit, he was in PSYOPs. To stay in the unit, he had to be jump qualified. At the age of, I don't know if he was 45, but he was close to it, they sent him to jump school. So on his first static line jump, he cracks a rib. So they said, well, you got a few more jumps coming. They said, if you quit the school now, at your age, you're never coming back. Well, wrap your ribs up, and we suggest you make the rest of the jumps, and he did. He got his jump wings.
One more.
What was the procedure in the field when an enemy soldier was encountered by the dog and its handler? What happened at that point?
Well, it depended. If I got an alert, I would call it in to the sergeant of the guard and let him know. Unless the sapper actually got through the second concertina wire, and I had a direct bead on him, I could fire then to save myself, obviously, self-defense. But otherwise, unless that was the case, I mean, this is the crazy army. They've got all these rules of engagement. I would have to call in.
Bob, we're going to wrap things up. I have a quick comment, and we want you to make your final presentation comments here after over 50 years. We've got a room full of people, final things you want to share. But Bob may not know this. How many of you knew that the original Rin Tin Tin dog was a World War I German dog? You did.
I knew that.
American soldiers found that dog in a German army trench after the Germans retreated and left, and as a young dog, they took him back to California, and the next thing you know, he's a hero in the movie. So, that's the original silent Rin Tin Tin in 1920. And the grandchild of that dog became the Rin Tin Tin that we knew when we were young, back in the early days. Did you know that?
I did.
Okay.
I did know that.
Final comments here to our room full of guests tonight. What would you like to share with us in closing?
I just think I would like to thank all of you for being here tonight and for your interest in my service. And there was a time where I couldn't get through talking about what happened with that little boy. And whether I had PTSD or not, I don't know, but I had certainly buried that very, very deep. And I've known about it for many years now, but in other circumstances like this, when I've tried to tell that, I haven't been able to get through it. Maybe it was because he was a little boy, and you know. But being here tonight with all of you, so many of you, of course, are interested in the military and history. So many of you are veterans, and it's just a wonderful thing to have you all here and to be able to tell you my story. So I just want to thank you so very much. Thank you.